when I was young and they were younger. And so our paths have finally crossed again, and we had a great time in the first service. So we hope to do the same again. You know, I gotta ask you, these red shoes.
Yeah.
I know he's a Viking fan, so you know, you expect anything. What's the deal? Is that just style? Good deal?
Yes and
Or is
yes.
this what you were looking for?
It is a fashion statement.
Oh.
I am nothing if not a fashionista. Just ask my wife.
Okay. I won't go any farther with that.
You ought to be able to tell by my Menards shirt and my Menards pants and my JCPenney shoes, I am a fashionista. Hey, I'm really glad to be here today. It's a great chance for my wife and I to share with you all, connect a little bit. You're sitting so far back. If I come down there, do you need to pick this up on the microphone, or can I stand down here and it'll be okay?
Go for it.
All right. I like to walk back and forth when I talk. It just helps me to kind of focus. People say, do you pace back and forth because you're nervous? No, I usually pace back and forth because I'm trying to hypnotize you. When I snap my fingers, you will awake and you will get out your checkbooks and write big checks to the Great Commission Fund. My wife and I are from Minnesota, B. Red Wing, her Roseville. I made a couple of moves as a young person with my family. We ended up in St. Croix Falls, Wisconsin. She went to Crown College. I went to Liberty University. Doesn't that just roll off your lips? And so we kind of ended up back at St. Croix Falls together, met there 6 months, start to finish, from when we met till we were married 6 months. And we've been together for over 38 years. Been serving in Taiwan for 32 of those 38 years, and have had a lot of experiences. Really looking forward to sharing with you tomorrow, tonight. Tonight's a potluck, right? So will there be tater tot hot dish? You don't know what tater tot hot dish is? Okay.
He's from Minnesota.
All right, you bring tater tot hot dish. And lime jello with shredded carrots. You can't have a church potluck without lime jello with shredded carrots and tater tot hot dish. So tonight, we're going to share a few things with you around the food, and then tomorrow night we're going to have some fun. Call it a prayer meeting, call it what you want, but we just want to connect with you guys, tell you some of our stories. I think you'll be blessed. So we're coming up here on the freeway yesterday. Drove over from Rochester, Minnesota, where we live. Bought a house there 4 years ago. And we're driving up here on the freeway yesterday. Coming up Highway 41 out of Oshkosh, right? Coming up here, and all of a sudden, got pulled over by a sheriff. Woo, woo, woo. Well, I shouldn't make fun of his speech impediment, but walks up to the car, and he says, sir, I see you weren't wearing your seatbelt. I said, yes, officer, I was wearing my seatbelt. He said, no, I can tell you were not wearing your seatbelt. I said, officer, I was wearing my seatbelt. He leans into the car and says, ma'am, was he wearing his seatbelt? And my wife looks at him and says, officer, there's one thing I've learned after being married to him for 38 years. Never argue with him when he's drunk. So we made it here. Penny, come on up and recover from that really bad joke.
That's not true.
You don't know that.
I think I better do it from up here. I'm not sure my voice will carry enough. So, by the way, for those of you who are still wondering about that thing, tater tot hot dish, to translate that into Wisconsin, that would be casserole. Okay? Hot dish is one of those Minnesota terms. Anyway, we are glad to be here. This is our first time to be in this part of Wisconsin, and we're just excited about the time to share with you this week. We've heard good things about your church. I know that you are a church that cares about missions and people around the world. You know, just like we were challenged in that video. I know that you do care, that you do pray, you take that seriously, and you do give. And I want to thank you, I want to encourage you, keep going. It is important. And I think for us, neither Tim and I grew up in the Alliance. We came into this family of churches, and we love it. It's become home to us. It's become family to us. Obviously, there's lots of good churches out there. There's lots of good mission organizations out there. But I love this quote about the Alliance. I think I pulled this off the Alliance website. It says, "The Alliance is committed to extending gospel presence. No matter how remote the location, how rugged the terrain, or how resistant the people, we go, and we stay until the gospel takes root and bears fruit." Like Tim said, we've been serving in Taiwan for the last 32 years. Now, Taiwan is a place where we can go in openly as missionaries. We can openly preach the gospel. There's freedom of religion. There's not persecution of Christians or anything like that. But it's one of those resistant places where people are not responding to the gospel, at least not yet. And yet we're thankful that we've been able to stay. We've been able to keep on trusting that one day there is going to be that spiritual breakthrough that we so much long for. Now, obviously, when you first go to a new country as a missionary, you have to learn a new language, which we did. We spent the first 2 years learning Mandarin Chinese. Later on, we also learned some of the Taiwanese dialect. It's an ongoing process for us. We're still learning, working on those languages. But you also learn a lot about culture. And some things about other cultures, it's easy to pick up, some of the do's and don'ts. Some things are more subtle, and it takes a while. It takes a while to break down those, that's just not right, kinds of feelings that come out of our own culture. Well, let me give you an example of one of the things that was always a bit of a challenge for me. When there are big gatherings in Taiwan, like maybe for a community, a holiday celebration, or school graduations, you've got a crowd of people, and including when our church does special events and invites the community in, it's like nobody is listening, especially when the main speaker is up talking. They're all talking, they're on their phones, they're getting up, they're moving around. It just feels chaotic. And we've seen that also in Taiwanese funerals. Taiwanese funerals are very different than funerals here. One of the big differences, in the countryside especially, is that when a family member dies, they set up a tent outside the home. It might block a whole lane of traffic on the street. And that tent will be there anywhere from a week to 2 weeks. The family is there at the tent all the time, and people just drop in whenever, sit down and visit and pay their respects. But then they do have that final funeral ceremony, the service type thing. And a Buddhist funeral, this is one of the things that you often see. These are family members who are crawling on their hands and knees as a sign of worship of the deceased person. That's one of the big obstacles we face in Taiwan, is ancestor worship. That's one of the things that keeps people from turning to Christ. But as I was talking about cultural things, they'll have the gathering inside the tent too, kind of the service. And again, you see people talking, and somebody will stop in for 5 minutes and then they're gone, or they're standing outside the tent doing business on their cell phone. And, I'm feeling like this seems really disrespectful. And I heard something a few years ago that kind of made things click into place a bit for me. They said, for a Taiwanese person, presence is participation. And what that means, just real simply, is for that grieving family, they really don't care if you're sitting quietly in your seat for that whole funeral service listening. You showed up. That's what matters to them. That's what shows them you care, that you're with them in their time of suffering. Even if you're there for 5 minutes, they don't care. You came. Your presence is important. And I think that's really not that different from our own culture. We show people we care by being there for the hard times, like funerals or hospitals, but also the joyful things, like weddings or baby dedications, things like that. We celebrate together. Our presence is important. As believers, I think one of the things that sets Christianity apart from other world religions is the fact of God's presence with his people. I don't know of any other religion that really talks about their God being present with them the way we do in Christianity. And it begins back in the Old Testament where God says to Moses, "My presence will go with you and I will give you rest." Think about that for just a second. This is the God that created the universe, And he's saying, my presence will be with you. I'm going to be with you. And then when Jesus came, we're told the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father full of grace and truth. God present with his people, coming into this and living among us. You know, in a dirty, difficult world, he came to be present with us. And after Jesus died, rose again, he ascended to heaven, he gives us his Holy Spirit to be present with us 24/7. We don't always feel his presence. It's not based on feelings. We have to hang on to that fact. So even today, whatever you might be going through, might feel like God's a long ways away, far away from you. Hang on to the fact he is present. That's a powerful, powerful thing. But there's another aspect of that. We have God's presence with us, but he also calls us who are followers of him to carry his presence to a lost and hurting world. If you've looked at the missions conference stuff, you see that the theme this year is be present. And that's what that whole idea is. That as Christ followers, we need to be present with the people around us. He tells us that you are the salt of the earth. You're the light of the world. Let your light shine before others that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. That's a call to every single one of us, not just missionaries, not just pastors, but every one of us is to carry God's presence. And it might be the only way that some of the people around you are ever going to catch a glimpse of God and of Jesus Christ is through you and through your life. So it's an important responsibility he gives us. This morning, for my part, Tim's going to come back up here in a few minutes too, but I want to share a little bit about what it's looked like for us the last 3 years to be present in Taiwan. And it was an interesting term for us. We like to say it was the worst term that we ever had in Taiwan, the 30 years there. It was a tough one. We hit a lot of difficult things, faced a lot of difficult things, but it was also a very good term because we saw God doing things, incredible things. I'm just going to share a little bit this morning. Tonight, got a few other stories about what God has done in our team in Taiwan. And it's exciting to stop for a minute and look at what he does. But it was also tough at times. Well, I like to call this thing a tale of two churches. Let's see if we get to that next one. There we go. A tale of two churches. Be present. I'm not sure why that got all mixed up on there. But anyway, two churches. One is a rural church, and the other is a city church. Both of them are church plants in Taiwan. One of those churches, in a sense, never should have survived the last 3 years because of some of the big hits the church took. The other church, a new church plant, really, in many ways, should not have gotten off the ground because of a lot of things that were against it, a lot of things that didn't seem to make sense. But in both of these situations, I don't want you to hear the challenges or the chaos or the problems. What I want you to really hear is what God did in the midst of it. Because let's face it, that's our lives. We all live with chaos, with problems, with obstacles, with challenges. But if our eyes are open, we can see God do incredible things, even in the midst of that. And sometimes even more so because of those things. So let me just jump right in. The first one I want to tell you about is called Amazing Grace Church. There it is. Okay. Amazing Grace Church. In 2006, my husband Tim and I moved to the countryside in Taiwan. Actually, our whole team began to focus that way. One of the least reached places in Taiwan. In the countryside, in this particular township that we moved to, there, at that point, was one very small church for about 30,000 people in the township. And we were able to start Amazing Grace Church. Countryside, it's very challenging. People are very traditional in their mindset, ancestor worship, and all of that. We knew it was going to be tough. We knew it would be slow going. I'm not sure we knew quite how slow it would be. Actually, all these years later, it's still a church plant. It still hasn't reached full maturity. But by God's grace, a church was started. Not a lot of people, but we were leading that church. And one of the goals that we have, and this is especially true in the Alliance, I think in many other groups too, but as missionaries, we don't want to be the ones leading everything. Often we start things, But as soon as possible, we want to see the local people leading it. So in our case, we wanted a Taiwanese pastor leading that church. And we prayed and we sought God for a pastor for that little church for 8 years from the time it started. And we could not get anyone to come. Various reasons. One, it's the countryside, and then nobody really wanted to move into a little tiny community in the countryside, a farming community. Very poor church, very small church. It wasn't an attractive place to go to. And again, a resistant community. We prayed and could not find anyone. Finally, after 8 years, we got a Taiwanese pastor. His English name is Amos. Pastor Amos came fresh out of our Alliance Bible College. That was in the summer of 2019. He had actually been our intern at the church for a couple years before that. So the people knew him, they trusted him, they loved him, they welcomed him, and he loved them. Seemed like he'd be a good fit. Yeah, he had some rough edges. He was very new at leading a church, but we hoped that with time he would grow in that. And so because Pastor Amos was there, it was time for us to transition out. We were looking for the next step, going on to the next church plant, which I'll tell you about in a few minutes. And it was kind of a gradual transition at first, but about 8 months after Pastor Amos got there, and by this time Tim had already left the church. I was still helping the church with some things, but Tim had already moved on to the next ministry. We got a call from Pastor Amos, and he said, "I need to talk to you. Something terrible has happened." And he came to our mission office and sat down and in tears said that over the weekend he had had a moral failure. He was repentant. It wasn't something that had dragged on a long time as a one-time thing, but obviously it was a severe thing, and he immediately had to resign from the church and leave his pastorate. And that little church was devastated. Within a week or two, several people left the church. So small church, even smaller. And we were left with big questions. What do? Do we come back in? We were already transitioning out. Do we come back in to again lead the church? Do we wait to see what God's going to do in this? And after praying, we sense, okay, we need to keep moving, but making trips back to help out the church during that very, very hard time. And I'll tell you right now, it felt hopeless. Again, we'd prayed 8 years before we got a pastor. Where were we going to get a pastor for this church? Some of our missionary colleagues, they said, maybe it's time we just shut this church down. There wasn't a lot left. Thankfully, we didn't. We kept going, kept praying. And this is the prayer that we prayed together with that church family. We took a passage of scripture from the Old Testament. This is a promise that God made back then. In Jeremiah 3:15, "Then I will give you shepherds after my own heart, who will lead you with knowledge and understanding." We said, God, you made that promise long ago to a different group of people. We're asking for that now. You're the only one that can help us, that can provide for us. And we prayed, but it was a hard time, a discouraging time. But within a few months, God answered that prayer. Pastor Amos left in mid-February. The beginning of May, our Alliance National Church president, Taiwan president, he called and he said, I know this couple. They live in Taipei, the capital of Taiwan, several hours away. They don't want to leave Taipei. They've got elderly family members they're taking care of, but maybe I can convince them to take trips down on the weekends to help lead your church. Are you interested in at least meeting them? And we said, yes, definitely, we're open. And we didn't know if they'd say yes or not, but they made a trip down, first time to our community. And from almost the moment they sat down, they said, if this church is willing to have us, we believe God's calling us here. Not part-time, but full-time. And the church, yes, they welcomed them. And God gave us James and Eva Chun. And I'll tell you right now, when God answers, he gives the best. Because this pastoral couple, they're probably the best Taiwanese pastoral couple we have ever worked with in our time in Taiwan. They've become good friends, and they lead well. And we're so, so thankful for what God did. Now, I wish I could tell you that was the end of the problems for that church. Not quite. About 6-8 months after Pastor James came, that was about the time that COVID was heating up. Taiwan never really faced some of the challenges that you faced in America with COVID. I think you had it much worse here. But obviously, it was a major concern there. And the panic was high in Taiwan. People were fearful because they were hearing reports around the world. But where we lived, there were no cases yet of COVID in where Amazing Grace Church is. And then the church had a Christian contractor come on down and do some construction work on the building. He lived up north, and he'd come down during the week and then go home on the weekends. And yeah, he guessed it, he contracted COVID, didn't know it at first. He thought it was just a bad cold, kept on working, and then realized, ended up being hospitalized and died soon afterwards. The church did everything they needed to do. We shut down services. Our pastor went into quarantine. He was the only one that had contact with this man. But again, panic was high. And this is small town where everybody knows everything. First case of COVID there. And we became known pretty much as the COVID church. Main street of town, but I'm sure people walked around to the other side of the street just to get by. They wouldn't go anywhere near it. And if they met church members, they would say, shouldn't you be at home in quarantine? What are you doing around? You're infecting all of us. A lot of fear. It didn't impact our church members, but it impacted the people we were trying to reach out to. We were the COVID church. They didn't want anything to do with us for a long time. But thankfully, God brought us through that difficult season. And then about a year after that, we had a situation common to many churches. We had a church member who had always been a bit of a challenging person, a difficult personality. A lot of conflict followed her, and finally escalated to a point where she left the church, but she also went around that small community spreading both lies and gossip about our pastor, about the church, to anybody who would listen to her. And yeah, that caused, again, a lot of damage, not to church members, but in the community, people were reaching. But I'll tell you this, God held on to that little church. Satan did not kill it. It's still a small church. This was probably taken, I think, January 1st of this year. It's still a small church, but there's a sweetness there. And there's a depth there that continues to grow. And there's a faithfulness on the part of this pastor who knows God's call to a difficult place. So I often refer to Amazing Grace Church as a church that Satan tried to kill. And then it hit me, well, basically every single church is a church that our enemy Satan is trying to kill, including this church. And he'll use every different tactic. If one thing doesn't work, there'll be another thing. And you faced it. I'm sure you have. In the past, maybe there's things now. There'll definitely be things in the future. And my encouragement to you is hang on to God. Keep your eyes on him, because the one we follow is greater than our enemy. But now I said this is a story about two churches. And the second church we call in English Gushing Grace Church. We don't call it that in Taiwan. That's a translation of the Chinese. It always kind of sounds a little hillbilly to us, Gushing Grace. But it's a literal translation because it uses the word in Chinese. Remember in the Old Testament, when the Israelites were in the wilderness, and Moses hit the rock and water gushed out. So this is Gushing Grace. Well, when we left Amazing Grace Church, we moved to a new community about an hour and a half, hour and 15 minutes south of there. The sixth largest city in Taiwan is called Tainan. And we had located a district of Tainan that had very few churches for the population. And said, our team decided that's where the next Alliance church plant was going to be. And as we became more and more familiar with that district, we found a new community, a brand new development. No church at all. Okay, this is going to be the location for the next church plant. Now, we've been involved in church planting for a lot of years, and I'll tell you this. We knew that at the start of this church, we were doing everything wrong, and we knew it. But the thing is, we were sensing God saying, do it, next step, kind of like they talked about risks. And you're thinking, this doesn't make sense. but God seemed to be keeping on moving on. So I say this is a church, our eyes, it shouldn't have gotten off the ground, but God was doing something incredible. So I would say if you're going to start a new church, one of the primary principles would be you go to where the people are. That just makes sense, right? Well, we didn't exactly do that. Like I said, this is a new development. When you see those buildings off in the distance, that's a different community. Our community was empty. All 100% new construction. There were high-rise apartment buildings being built, townhouses, new school. It was all coming, but when we moved in, it wasn't there. And we literally had very, very few neighbors. Now, I will tell you, why would we move there? Because the government has a plan that within the next maybe 8 years, 30,000 people are going to move into that new development. We're on the ground floor. But in those early months, it was kind of a strange place to be, because how do you start a church when you have no people around you? And yet we had a sense that God's saying, yes, be here. Well, what do? How do we meet people? We did have a next door neighbor. And one day our next door neighbor, he's not a Christian, but he knew Tim was a pastor or a missionary. And he said to him, have you started a church yet? Tim said, no. He said, well, have you started a prayer center? Remember, this guy's not a Christian. We have never heard of a prayer center before in Taiwan, but we thought, that's not a bad idea. And so we hung a banner on the outside of our building, prayer center. We knew people were not going to flock to a prayer center. That's just not how it works in Taiwan. So why did we do it? It was a way to declare who we were, what we were about, to say this is where God's presence is. And just let that community know that we're Christians. And again, people did not flock to a prayer center, but we did begin to meet people because of that sign. And as more and more people moved into our community, we also began to meet some Christians. Now, I'd say another thing about church planting is usually you're going to start with a solid core group before you launch a church. That just makes sense. Well, eventually, we met a few people. Tim calls this church sometimes the garbage truck church. Why? You know that song, very familiar song, you might not know the name, it's called Fur Elise. There it goes, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-dum. You know that one? In Taiwan, when you hear that music, you grab your garbage and you head out to the street and you throw it in the garbage truck. That's the garbage truck music. They play the song as the truck is coming by, you know they're there, and you throw your garbage in. And so going to throw the garbage became the time where we began to meet people, and we began to meet our neighbors. And sometimes we would just purposely not throw in the garbage truck as it came in front of our house. We'd go to this side of our complex or that side of our complex so we could meet neighbors. And eventually we met 3 women. All 3 of these women are Christians, but they're Christians who had been away from church for many years. The 2 in green had been raised in Christian homes in Taiwan, but had married non-Christian husbands, hadn't been to church in years. The woman in the middle had gone through a messy divorce and deep depression and had left the church. And we became friends with these women. And God seemed to be saying, start for them, for their sake. We didn't even know if they would come, but we sensed God saying, start for them. And so we said, well, in January, we're going to start having just a time to gather at our house, sing some songs, praise God together, listen to the word together. Please come. It seemed like an odd way to start things, but they came. And they're still part of that church today. Now, the other thing about church planting, environment can be an important thing. If people walk in and it's kind of a messy, crazy building, sometimes they don't stay. Well, we didn't exactly have an ideal place. It had possibilities, but we lived in a 5-story townhouse, and we thought someday maybe that first floor could be used for a church plant. But at that time, it had no door. It was a garage. So once the garage door's up, it's up for anything. We also had agreed to store the furnishings of a missionary family coming back to the States on home assignment. So 2/3 of that first floor was full of stuff packing boxes and furniture. Not exactly an attractive place to invite people in for a worship service. But again, God kept saying, go, trust me. And so we did. Not only did those 3 women come, eventually others began to come. And God planted that church. By the time we left last June, this was before we left, this isn't the whole group that was attending. There were more than that. That's a part of the group. God just began bringing people in. So then how do we step away? Well, about the time the church started, God gave us a new missionary couple, very unique in that they are Taiwanese. They've been in the U.S. for many, many years and wanted to go back to their homeland as missionaries. So didn't need visas, didn't need to learn the language. They could plug right in. And Jason and Andy Huh are now leading Gushing Grace Church. And yes, they've continued to add to their numbers. God has built this church in amazing ways. But I like to call it a church that really shouldn't have gotten off the ground when I look at how we started things. But God is good. 2 churches. One that Satan tried to kill, the other shouldn't have gotten off the ground, but because of God's grace and his power, those 2 churches are going on today. And you know, I don't know this church well. I don't know your past. I don't know what challenges you face. I don't know the future. But I know that whatever you face, hang on to God, and he will continue to lead you and take you to the next step. Trust him. I'd be willing to take risks maybe, but trust him in this. Jesus prayed a prayer in John 17 where he says, as you sent me into the world, I have sent them into the world. May they also be in us so that the world may believe that you have sent me. This is a prayer he prayed for every one of us. This isn't just for missionaries or pastors. This is for every person who follows him. He has sent you into the world so that people may believe in him. And then I love what it says in 1 Peter. It says, you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. That's his call to every single one of us, to carry his presence to a lost and hurting world. And, you know, whether it's Taiwan, which greatly needs the gospel, or whether it's right here in Wisconsin, we know that all around us, it's a lost and hurting world. And God's calling you to be present where you are, whether it's in your workplaces, whether it's in your schools, your neighborhoods, in your own family. Some people may only see the presence of God through you, and he asks us to be present for that. Now, he may also be calling you to go to some of those hard places where we were challenged about in that video earlier. And he asks us just to be ready, to say, Lord, wherever you want me, but wherever he places you, in whatever way he calls you, be fully present to him. I'm going to ask Tim to come up right now. I put on that next slide.
Wait just a second. I want to ask you a question. All right. So after the last service, Penny and I were out there in the foyer, and the opportunity was given for people to come up and just chat with us. And I had one person with me. God bless Jeff. And I look over and you've got this whole crowd around you. How do you do that? Is it because I'm telling the bad jokes and you're not?
That could be it. That could be it.
By the way, those jokes, they play really well in Minnesota. Just want you to know, just saying. I heard that, yes, really. So anyway, we want to be present in Taiwan. That's just what we're about, however that looks. And it's going to look different ways in different places, different contexts. We've done a lot of things in 32 years in Taiwan. Penny did not tell you the half of what we went through this last 3-year term in Taiwan, with all the conflict that we had. And by the way, when you have conflict, you need to look in the mirror and say, what am I bringing to the conflict? You can't just throw it off on the other person, the other party. That's not fair. And especially if it's conflict in the church, you can't just put it off and say it's their fault. You've got to say, maybe I'm bringing something here, because you owe it to yourself and that relationship. You owe it to the local church. If it's within this body, you owe it to this body. And you owe it to the church at large, the Church of Jesus Christ, that you might be contributing. This is really important stuff. We've experienced this. We went through a lot of it. Most of it, we were able to handle in a healthy manner and get it resolved. There's an issue or two that's still hanging out there, and we've tried. It just didn't work out. So I say all of that to say, we had this really lousy term, but in the midst of all this junk, we're seeing all these blessings. People finding Christ and people coming into the church and churches being planted and growing. It was really cool. So best of times, worst of times. So when we got done with that last term and came back on home assignment last June, we had 4 years previously bought a house in Rochester, Minnesota. We just wanted to come back to the States and just settle. We just wanted to process all that we'd been through, kind of get our head together and take a deep breath and kind of get ready for next steps. 5 weeks into our term, go to the next slide, please. 5 weeks into our term, we are home at night, we live in a small house. We're in the back of the house getting ready for bed, 11:09 p.m., lights are out, very dark in our house, and we hear the squealing of tires, and we hear this impact, and then a millisecond later we heard and felt an impact, and we had no idea what was going on. And so we stumble out of the back. I go into the kitchen to turn the light on and fell face down on the kitchen floor. I had no idea why. There's nothing that should have made me fall in my kitchen. And when Penny finally got the light on, this is what we saw. 2 cars were street racing on our residential street in Rochester. Alcohol was a factor. One lost control, impacted a car in the driveway to our east, totaled that car, continued on, impacted our house in our kitchen corner, demolished our kitchen, demolished the front of the house, sent our cement steps flying 64 feet, yes, I measured it, ended up upside down in the driveway to the west of us. Alcohol and speed, not a good idea, gang. So this is what we're dealing with. We wanted a nice, quiet, peaceful home assignment. God says, I have something else for you. That's like, really? And we're wondering why. You know, years ago I heard this phrase, you can ask God why inquisitively, but you cannot ask God why accusatively. You get it? You say, God, why did this happen? That's okay. But you can't say, God, why did this happen? That's not okay. So, fortunately, through all we had gone through in our last term, I learned a new phrase in Chinese. Shen Kai Gao Ding. It simply means, God's got this. God's got this. God's in control. So, while I think this is out of control, and the one car obviously was out of control, God's got this. He's in control. A lovely young lady came up to our house the next day. She said, hello, I'm a reporter from a certain TV station. May I interview you? I said, sure, fine. Flaming orange hair, 20 years old or so, and just an amazing young lady. We sat down, we talked for a while. We're walking back out to her car, and I said, by the way, Ann, I want to let you know, my wife and I are evangelical Christians. We are missionaries in Taiwan. And as Christians, we don't always understand all of this. We don't know why it happens. But we do know God is in control. He's got a purpose and a plan. And so we can see God in this. The next day, the article comes out online. Oh, Ann, by the way, Ann told me, she said, well, that's nice. I'm not very religious myself. Okay, that's okay. We're all on a faith journey. And so the next day the article came out, and Ann wrote this headline for the article, Homeowner Sees God in Crash that Destroys House. And I'm thinking, what kind of an idiot, this wacko Christian did she paint me out to be? He sees God. Ann nailed it. Absolutely nailed it. What I said, she wrote about me being a Christian and about me understanding God's in control and all this good stuff. And that article went out throughout southern Minnesota. We had people from an hour away come up to us in a church and said, I saw that article. We had people stopping by our house saying, I saw that article, I'm a Christian too, and we had great fellowship. That testimony for Jesus Christ went out in a way that we never would have imagined, never would have had the opportunity had that not happened. Shankai Gaudingma, has God got this? Absolutely. Absolutely. So that's what we're dealing with on our home assignment. Not the kind of home assignment we would have wanted, but God had different plans. I found out long ago, God rarely listens to my plans. So, what else are we dealing with? We've got a new granddaughter. This is really cool. And this is like the first church I've announced this in where nobody's applauded. I know, I always get that. Like I had anything to do with it. Our son, we have 3 kids. Our second son settled in Rochester, Minnesota, and he had 1 child at the time, which is why we settled in Rochester, Minnesota. We have no other grandkids. And then he also presented us with our granddaughter. So the 2 grandkids are both in Rochester, and we're enjoying them and have a good time with them. So this is the bright side of our home assignment. Next slide, what we are going back to when we return to Taiwan in June. People always ask me, you're older, you're 64, are you getting ready to retire? No, I want to keep going. I think I've got some fire in my bones yet. I really do. And I just think I've got some stuff to contribute. So as long as the Lord gives strength, I'll keep going back. But we don't exactly know what we're going back to. So we do need your prayers. Hey, come out tomorrow night. I want to share more about this. One of the things that we need prayer about is that I'm going to be field director. So pray for our field, right? But as field director, I'm just kind of in charge of our Alliance Missionaries in Taiwan. But we don't know where we're going to live. We don't know what other kind of ministries we'll be involved with. We might go back with James and Eva and work with them. Might go back to Tainan at Gushing Grace and work with them. Just really don't know at this point. So we do need prayers for that, for wisdom and guidance. But thanks for giving us a chance to share today. This is what we've been doing, what we're kind of doing now, where we're heading in the future. But we want you to partner with us. And I asked a guy one time, Brian, tomorrow you're leaving for college. Wouldn't you like to take Jesus with you? And you come back tomorrow night and I'm going to tell you how he answered me.
Let's stand together. I'm here to say that whatever your situation is, give God a chance. He'll take care of it. He'll work it through if you're patient and hang on. Let's pray. Thank you, Lord, and I pray for each person here. Give them patience. Help them to cry out to God. And ask God to fix what needs to be fixed. To give the best. Let us not settle for something not the best. Thank you for our missionaries, in Jesus' name. And we'll let them leave first so that they get set so you can talk to them. If you want to, there's a basket you can give to them, and